Good evening, everyone. The time is now 7 p.m., and that means it is time for another of the Military Aviation Museum's ongoing series of webinars. Hopefully, you're able to see our guest this evening through his webcam window. And we're actually going to be talking with him over the course of this evening about some really interesting historical dimensions of the founding of the nation of Israel. So thank you all for joining us for another of our Military Aviation Museum webinars. I'm Keegan Chetwin, the director of the museum. Our speaker tonight is Boaz Dvir, an author, a filmmaker, and now professor at Pennsylvania State University. And he's going to be speaking to us about his book, Saving Israel, the Unknown Story of Smuggling Weapons and Winning a Nation's Independence. Boaz's work was one of the first pieces to uncover this incredible tale of international arms smuggling in an effort to prevent what many believed could have been a second Jewish genocide. It also unearthed the birth of Israel's Air Force and even its national airline, El Al, in a roundabout sort of a way, while showing how World War II veterans from across the globe chose to stand up to defend innocent civilians with or without the support of their home government just a few years after the conclusion of World War II. It's an incredible story, and Boaz tells it much better than I do. So I'm going to go ahead and hand the session on over to him. Boaz, are you ready?
Yes, thank you, Keegan. Thank you so much, and Victoria and Jerry. And thank you, Bobby, and the rest of our outreach team for the book and the films. Lily, thank you, and Grace, and Jess, and Marissa. Excited to speak with you tonight. Thank you for coming in online. Wish we were in person. I would love to see this museum. Looks amazing online. I would love to see all those planes. So I'll find some other excuse maybe in the future to come down, bring my boys with me. They'd love it. And you know, I'm going to tell you the story. I'm not going to at all kind of try to slice and dice it in any particular way. But along the way, as I tell you the basic story, I'm going to try to emphasize some of the aviation aspects of it because it is an aviation, right, museum. So we'll try to focus on that along the way. So I'll talk less about, let's say, geopolitics as I might usually, and more about the type of planes that this operation used. Don't worry, we won't get too technical. We'll just kind of try to have fun with it. So yeah, this is a illegal, a secret operation that took place between 1947 and 1949 that, yes, literally saved Israel. Israel was going to be destroyed. Well, how this operation came about is really almost by happenstance. So the aviator at the center of the story is a man named Adolf Schwimmer, a Jewish boy with the name Adolf, who then obviously didn't want to go by Adolf and went by Al the rest of his life. Grew up during the Depression in Connecticut and fell in love with aviation and always wanted to become an owner of an airline. And in late 1947, he does become an owner of an airline, but not through a direct effort. In the years in between, he becomes an aviator, he becomes a flight engineer, he gets a job with TWA before World War II. During World War II, he continues with TWA. TWA becomes the Air Transport Command for the US Army Air Forces. It wasn't yet Air Force like we have today. It was the US Army Air Forces, as it was known, but continues basically as a flight engineer the whole way through and so forth. Right after the war, just goes back to civilian duty. So he doesn't take any real action that we know of to actually launch an airline. And yet he ends up with an airline in 1947. How did that happen? And what kind of an airline was it really? So after World War II, he is tasked with finding out what happened to his mother's side of the family in Europe. And he searches all over Europe and discovers, you know, based on documents, etc., that most practically, maybe all of the family perished during the Holocaust in Nazi concentration camps. But as he visits a couple of these camps, he is also struck by the fact that you still have Jews as inmates in these camps. They're still, really to a large degree, living almost a similar life to what they had during the war. No one's executing them. No one's lining them up and shooting them. No one's forcing them to do any labor. They're getting better food, but they're trapped. They can't go anywhere. Many of them are still wearing the pajama-like uniform that they had before. In other cases, when they didn't have enough of those, they're giving them Nazi uniforms. Some of their former guards are still there because they're now prisoners in this place, and because they have more experience, the British, the Americans asked the Nazis to run these camps. It's a very strange situation, and he's really puzzled and upset by it and wants to do something about it. And he discovers that the reason they're stuck is that no one wants them except for one entity, the Jewish community in Palestine, which is on the opposite end, where everybody else wants nothing to do with these people, which really was a mistake because they ended up, you know, not all of them, of course, but as a population, Holocaust survivor ended up really contributing a great deal to society on many fronts, whether it's medicine or technology or artistic endeavors. But regardless, you know, no one wanted it in the time. There were refugees, there were skeletons, thousands of them were still dying every day. But the Jewish entity in Palestine wanted them. And American Jews were helping that cause. They were buying ships, sending those ships to Europe, sticking as many refugees as they possibly could on the ships, and sending them to Palestine. But the British, who controlled Palestine at the time, would intercept the ships on the Mediterranean and take the Jews, the refugees, to camps, mostly in Cyprus. Although later on, they actually even ended up taking many of them back to former Nazi concentration camps. You think they would have the wisdom to pick other locations. But regardless, Al's idea was, why are you sending them via ships? Fly them in. You see, the ships are really sitting ducks. I mean, and they're there for a long time on the Mediterranean. They're easy to spot. The British Air Force sees them, alerts the Navy comes and takes them away. It's not much of a challenge. But planes, you know, planes can go much, much faster, obviously, and do it at night, undetected. And yeah, you'll need a lot more planes than you do ships, but you'll actually bring them in. So he finds out that the Jewish agency, the representative of the Jewish community in Palestine, has an office in a place called Hotel 14 in Manhattan. Hotel 14, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it, but was the home of the Copacabana. Copacabana was the famous club where, you know, among many other artists, Frank Sinatra really kind of built his reputation and sang there for several years at the height of his popularity, actually, in the late 40s. And he goes there, he goes to this office and knocks on their door. They takes, you know, he doesn't take no for an answer, but they'll, you know, so he keeps coming back, but they keep saying no. So he doesn't take it for an answer, but it doesn't really help him. They're not interested. First, who is this guy, Adolf Schwimmer? Second, I don't know, building an air force to fly in refugees. They're not interested, but he keeps going. And one day, a new head of that office arrives, a man named Yehuda Arazi, who is the basis for the protagonist of Exodus, for instance. I'm sure you know the movie Exodus. The protagonist is based on Yehuda Arazi, a savvy, innovative, forward-thinking guy who really loves what Schwimmer has to tell him, not so much about the refugees, but more so about the Air Force that he believes Israel, or it wasn't called Israel yet, but we'll just call it Israel. It's easier instead of saying the Jewish community of Palestine. So let's just call it Israel, even though it doesn't technically become so till a few months later. He sees the wisdom in that. You see, this is probably the first big gift that Al Schwimmer and the secret operation, that these Americans, all World War II veterans, almost all aviators, Jews and non-Jews, these were in equal numbers, who joined in for various reasons. And the first gift that they gave was to actually convince the Israelis that they should and could have an Air Force. They did not see that. It felt out of their scope. They had something called an air service, Shirut Dvir, that had small planes, some propeller planes and others. But they didn't even imagine that they could build an Air Force. So that excited Yehuda Arazi to a great degree. And he gave Al Schwimmer money and said, go do it, go build it. And Al, you know, when he came up with this idea initially, he actually wasn't planning on carrying it out. But here was an opportunity to actually have an airline. This is how he ends up with an airline. It's even called, at least in its first iteration, they had to come up with several others, Schwimmer Aviation. So here he is in 1947, suddenly the president of an airline, as he pictured, with money to buy planes. The only problem, of course, is that it was not a real airline. It was a fake, very much a fake airline. not meant for commercial purposes at all. What was it meant for if it wasn't meant for refugees? Well, Yehuda Arazi's main job at the time when he came to the States was to procure weapons. The Jews knew after the UN voted in November 29, 1947, that they would, at least in theory, receive half the land on which they can create a Jewish state. That's what the UN had decreed. And the Jews took that deal. The Arabs did not. The Arabs said, why should we? And I don't want to, again, get too much into geopolitics, but I think it is worth saying that the Arabs had their side. You know, they said, first of all, Arabs make up 2/3 of the land. Why are we only being given half? Unfair. Second, this is clearly a result of what happened in Europe. Well, we're not responsible for the Holocaust. That's a European crime, not an Arab crime. There was no Holocaust in the Arab world. No, actually, even anything like the Inquisition or any of the other crimes that we saw through the centuries in Europe. So why are we being punished? Also, it felt like imperialism once again, right? The US, Britain, all these other countries, none of them want anything to do with these refugees, but let's send them to Palestine, let's send them to the Middle East. So the Arabs, you know, they were not interested in that deal, and they didn't need to accept the deal because the Jews in Palestine, there were 600,000 of them, did not have the means to protect themselves against an invasion. So the Arabs said, you know what, British are going to leave on in mid-May 1948. We'll just take the whole thing. We'll just come in and take the whole thing. Who's going to stop us? The Jews have no weapons, right? In fact, even going, you know, even a month before the war, the Palestinian Jews had only one weapon for 3 or 4 soldiers. And on the first day of the war, May 15th, 1948, on the very first day of the war, Israel had 60,000 troops. It's a pretty good number, 10% of the population. And many of them were really qualified. These were not just random people. Many of them had been fighting for years. They've been fighting the British. They've been fighting the Arabs. They fought for the British, many of them, during World War II against the Germans. They had experience, but Israel only activated 20,000 of the 60,000. Only 20,000 on the first day of the war, because it only had enough weapons for them. And then quickly, because of the operation, they were able to send more and more troops into battle. But we'll get to that. So, you know, Israel knew that they needed to get weapons. And that's why Arazi came to the US, still hoping that he could actually even buy it from the US government, which was really an illusion. And he quickly, very quickly, saw how wrong he was. So about a week after the UN decides to split Palestine, it was called the partition plan between the Jews and the Arabs, and in a sense allowed the creation of a Jewish state, possibly allowed the creation of a Palestinian state, although there was no talk of it at the time by anyone really serious. The Arabs, but then again, they were thinking they would just invade the country. It wasn't clear how they were going to split it up. Would have been a mess if they had won. But anyway, regardless, on December 5th, 1947, Truman signs an arms embargo against selling any weapons to the Middle East, meaning there's no way the Israelis are going to get any weapons from the US. And you might say it's an arms embargo, so it's going to affect the Arabs. Well, yeah, in the sense that the Arabs didn't get any weapons from the US either. In fact, Saudi Arabia even was turned down in its request a couple times during those months when they made a request for advanced weapons. But it really didn't affect most of the Arab effort because they were being equipped, supplied, armed, and trained, and led into battle in many cases by the British. That was the case for the Egyptians, the Transjordians, the Jordanians, and the Iraqis. The Syrians, the Lebanese were getting their weapons from the French and the Czech. So Arazi also tasked Al not just with building an airline, but also actually helping in the effort to find weapons, which it's its own story, but because we're focusing on the aviation part, I probably won't get into it as much, although I'm happy to answer it during the Q&A. What I will say is that now Al has an airline called Schwimmer Aviation, and he's tasked with fixing planes, big transport planes, in order to be ready to lift weapons to Israel. it becomes clear that it's probably not going to be out of America. America is not going to do it, most likely, although there was some pressure on Truman from Congress people to change his mind, and even from people in his own party and people close to him, but he never budged. But instead, this airline was to be ready to go and airlift weapons from anywhere on the planet from which the Jews could actually purchase them, which at the time was unknown. There were some negotiations, and we'll get to that in a second. So Al goes to the War Asset Administration, which was trying to unload thousands of surplus planes. The US had built thousands and thousands of planes for World War II that it no longer needed. And really, it was expensive to maintain. It was expensive to transport. You had to fly them in from some of these bases that were now being closed. Some of the bases that the US had around the world, like let's say in Cairo, were being transferred over to the local population. And so the US was selling. The US set up this office to just sell all of these planes that were expensive to manufacture and maintain for really close to nothing. And Al bought 10 C-46s, Commandos, the famous C-46s that flew over the hump in China. He bought 10 of them for $5,000 each. And he bought 3 Constellations, Lockheed Constellations called Connies, for $15,000 each. The Lockheed Constellation, I'm sure many of our audience members know that plane, but if you don't, you might want to look it up somewhere. It's considered one of the most beautiful planes in history. It's just gorgeous. And so he has these 13 planes, and he sets up shop in 2 places. He wants to hedge his bet, so he doesn't want to do it in one place. One is the Lockheed Aviation Center in Burbank, and the second is in Millville, New Jersey. Those are the 2 locations where he sets up shop, splits the planes, hire mechanics. Some of them have no idea what kind of outfit this is. Others do. The ones that don't soon kind of figure it out, because the FBI soon is monitoring their activity on a daily basis, coming in and questioning, looking through files, raiding their offices, bringing in people for questioning, installing a spy. They succeeded with one spy who posed as a mechanic in Burbank. But the others that are being recruited, the other aviators know what this is about. So the other aviators include pilots, co-pilots, navigators, flight engineers. And they're being recruited anywhere and everywhere that they can possibly find them, because they're going to need a bunch. For each one of these transit planes, they need several, right? They got to have a pilot and a co-pilot, and at least a radio operator / navigator, hopefully both. Flight engineer was a bit of a luxury, but where they could, especially for the Connies, they tried to do that too. And so they kind of spread out throughout the country, and then eventually throughout North America, and then soon after that throughout the globe, looking for people to join them. And they feel that they must tell them the truth at that level. If a mechanic's working in Burbank fixing a plane, maybe they sense it's better off if he doesn't even know anything about this. But if they're going to be flying somewhere to pick up weapons, well, we better tell them up front, right? If we're asking them to quit their jobs. And as you might imagine, it's tough to find people, but also to some degree, it goes even better than they expect. In other words, it's tough, but they expected it to be tough. Of course, where are they going to find them? How are they going to convince them at a time of an economic boom, when there's so many jobs out there, and so many people are done also fighting, and they already paid their dues, right? I mean, they already spent 2, 3, 4 years fighting. Now they're back home. Maybe they're starting a career in aviation. Maybe they're going to college. Maybe they're getting married. Maybe the combination of all the above. How are you going to convince people like that to leave all that, and not only to go risk your life again, but to do something illegal? And doing something illegal is a problem for most people, right? But even more so for these aviators. Number one, these are patriots, right? These are the biggest patriots, the greatest generation. They were World War II heroes who fought for the good side. They loved America. Why would they suddenly go against America? America was very clear: stay out of this conflict. America not only passed the arms embargo, but reactivated the 1930s Neutrality Act, saying no Americans should get involved in this conflict. on any level. So, you know, patriotic, now you're going to go against your country. Clearly, you know, the smart people on top, people like Secretary of State George Marshall, the father of the Marshall Plan, the man Truman admired most, a brilliant strategic mind, and not one bit anti-Semitic in any way, shape, or form. Just agree. Gives speeches even in the UN, speaking out against the creation of a Jewish state and how it was a mistake and how really it would hurt America's interests. America's interest was to spread democracy, build up the economy globally, and was doing so in Europe, was doing so in Asia, in the Middle East. This was not in America's interest. So America's against it. So these guys that are being recruited are being asked to go against their own government. And so it's an illegal, and maybe to some of them, somewhat even of a moral dilemma type of quandary. And then on top of that, they could lose their citizenship, something that no longer is in effect today. Today, you can be a criminal, doesn't mean they strip you of your citizenship. But back then they could, especially for these purposes, they could take away. So you could lose your US citizenship, you can end up in prison, you can end up going against your own government, your own State Department. Oh, and you might also lose your life. Oh, and on top of that, you know, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. These people don't have weapons. Everyone's expecting them to lose. So you're probably also jumping into a losing effort. How do you sell that? I don't know. I don't know. But they did. And many aviators joined, enough to get going, several dozens initially, and eventually 300. This operation that really, you know, as Keegan briefly mentioned, was far reaching because it did create an Air Force and was involved in the fighting. So it did a lot more than even finding and smuggling weapons, which would have been enough. 300, you know, they came. These aviators came. So why did they come? You know, and I've asked them. I interviewed about 30 operation members, not all operation and family members, right? Most of them were operation members. Some, in some cases, they were gone already, and so I interviewed the daughter or the son, who had clear memories, talked to their parents about it. So, you know, were able to give me the information we needed. Why did they join? Well, they joined for various reasons. You might think the Holocaust played a big role, especially maybe among the Jewish people. And it did for some. For instance, a pilot named Bill Novick out of Montreal. He had served in the Canadian Air Force, came home, studying, and was aiming to go to med school. And just as he gets accepted to med school, he also receives a request to join this operation. His dream was to go to med school. He just got accepted. Very difficult then as it is now. You know, everyone was trying to go to med school right after World War II, this, especially with the government paying for it. So big decision, but he told me really ultimately not that much, because he felt he had to do something because of the Holocaust. So some people were driven by that, by the Holocaust, but others were driven by other reasons. So for instance, Harold Livingston, who was Jewish, told me, I never had a connection to Judaism at all. He was a radio operator during World War II and continued as such, and was one of the very first, he was the first radio operator to join the operation and one of the very first people to join. He had known Al Schwimmer, he had known the chief pilot, Sam Lewis, he knew him, he was with them, he worked with them during World War II and on occasion at TWA as well. But the reason he joined, he told me, is altogether different. It wasn't the Holocaust, it wasn't Judaism, it wasn't Israel, he was not a Zionist, it was the action. He actually missed the action. For some people, call it an addiction, call it an excitement that you know, routine life just did not offer for them. And here was an opportunity to go back to the time of nonstop, what to us would be stress, but I guess to him and some other people would be just joy of some sort, or adrenaline, or some sort of fuel that he missed. So that was another reason that some people joined. Some joined for the money. You know, some of the non-Jews, especially the fighter pilots that were brought in later, were offered large sums of money and took it. Others were misfits who really didn't have anywhere else to go. So they came. They were good pilots, but for various reasons, other airlines and other air forces were not interested in their services. They had reputations as troublemakers. I don't necessarily need to give names, but there were several of them. Israel took them. Israel took them. If someone was good at flying and was willing to come in and fight, if he was going to be a troublemaker, then that's the price we have to pay. So these aviators came in, and even though they came in from various walks of life and various situations and various reasons, they were united by one thing. They all, and this I heard over and over again, so it wasn't so much about the Holocaust that had happened. And by the way, they didn't even call it the Holocaust then. It was called a catastrophe, or the destruction. One of those two terms were used, and it was not something that was fully understood yet and digested like we know what it is today. They saw it, they were shocked by it, but it wasn't fully understood yet. They were more concerned, and they were united, all of them, with preventing a second genocide. Now, would there have been a second genocide? Had the Arabs won, would that have been a genocide? I honestly don't think so. I don't. And that's only because there was never a genocide in the Arab world prior to that. The Arabs had never carried out. Yes, there were some pogroms against Jews and massacres, no question, over the years. And in some cases, Jews were exiled, and in other cases kicked out and made second-class citizens. In some, I'm not saying it was a heavenly existence completely in the Arab world, but there's not a real genocide or an attempt at a real genocide to wipe out, annihilate the Jews like we saw in Europe. So I don't know. Maybe I'm too optimistic. However, I can tell you that the aviators who participated in this operation absolutely thought that there would be genocide. They thought of it as a second Holocaust, is how they refer to it. At this point, of course, looking back, I'm sure then they used other terms. Maybe they called it a second destruction. And the reason was the statements in particular that were being made by the Arab leaders. The Arab leaders were using such language: we'll sweep the Jews to the sea, we'll finish what Hitler started, we'll complete the final solution. It was several key leaders saying this, from the leader in Jerusalem to the Arab League's leader to so forth and so on, making really, strong statements. They had the means to do it. They had to take him on face value and had to operate with this urgency of, we got to save these 600,000 people. So even those among them who were not even necessarily Zionists or had any strong connection to the cause per se, were racing against the clock and against all sorts of different obstacles, like their own government, their own FBI, racing against the clock to prevent, in their mind, the annihilation of 600,000 Jews. Now, even though I don't believe there would have been a genocide, I don't think it would have been pretty either. I think it would have been a massive massacre. I think thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands of civilians would have died. Many would have been raped. It would have been beyond traumatic at any point, but particularly, of course, on the fields after the Holocaust. So it was a very serious situation that very few people around the world took seriously or thought too much about. They just saw an entity that had little chance to survive, and they really didn't do anything to help it. But these guys did. So they bought these planes and started to fix them, but the FBI kept bothering them and kept shutting down their airlines. Schwimmer Aviation goes out the window. They start Service Airways. That gets shut down. Eventually, Israel finds a country willing to sell it weapons in secret to break the international arms embargo. Because besides the US, the UN ends up passing an arms embargo, which is ironic, because here's the same entity that says we will allow the creation of a Jewish state, but then soon after, through the US's lobbying, but nonetheless then eventually says, but we're not going to allow them to defend themselves. Regardless, Czechoslovakia, communist Czechoslovakia, agrees to sell them weapons. And suddenly Yehuda Arazi and Al Schwimmer are geniuses, right? Because they have built an air force to be able to airlift these weapons. Otherwise, there's no way to get them out. This is a landlocked country in Eastern Europe. They did, after they made the fair sale, they did put some of the weapons on the ship. And that ship did eventually reach Israel. However, it took a very long time, took about 5 weeks, and got noticed too much. In other words, there was no way that they could do it again. It was a one-time deal. So really, the only way to get it out, this arms deal, which was massive, was by air with the C-46s and the Connies. There was no other way. So how do you get them there? How do you get these planes to Czechoslovakia when they are officially, legally grounded? So they find out, Al Schwimmer and some of the others find out that Panama had built a new international airport, brand new, millions of dollars, beautiful, but lacks its own national airline. So they come up with a great idea. They approach Panama and sell them on this notion of becoming their national airline, ready to go, 13 beautiful planes, including 3 Connies. I mean, they really sell them. They create a brochure, they put a presentation together, you know, they fly down, I mean, they do the whole thing. And now they're registered as Panama's national airline. Technically, the US can't stop them. And they take off. And just like in the movies, and this happens not quite simultaneously, it's a day apart, but happens in a very similar way, both in Burbank, California, and in Millville, New Jersey, where the FBI in Burbank, and actually the Treasury Department, the T-men who were carrying out that aspect of the operation on behalf of the State Department, actually drive on the tarmac and try to prevent the planes from flying, and even shoot at them as they take off. But they take off and they fly to Panama. And they fly through Mexico City, which has very high elevation. And even though it has a long runway, it's very tough to clear that runway. And there, the first C-46 crashes. It crashes. And the pilot and co-pilot, the co-pilot was a non-Jew who was a mechanic, actually, so he was a mechanic and worked as a mechanic, but they needed a co-pilot, volunteered to become a co-pilot. And so he was in the know once he became a co-pilot, and he stuck with it. Everyone spoke very highly of him. And both of them, it crashes and they die. Both of them die. And the rest of the planes, they get to Panama, you know, they keep going. But when they get to Panama, well, first they have to, you know, play the game because they're greeted by this big party. The president of Panama is there, and everyone's excited, and there's a band and food, and oh wow, this is our national airline, right? But after that, there's a mutiny against Al Schwimmer in particular. Why? They believed that the plane crashed because it was overloaded. And why was it overloaded? Because Al Schwimmer insisted explicitly, and he has confirmed this to me, he does not deny it, that he ordered everyone to overload their planes, because they were not just getting the planes out, mind you, they were also getting out engines, spare engines, equipment, tools, everything that they would need, right, to function as an airline. They were taking it with them. Also some weapons. They managed to mostly steal, actually, some weapons that they stole from the US Navy. Anyway, so yeah, he told them to overload it, made Mexico City, which is already a challenging place from which to take off, even more challenging. And they lost a C-46, and more importantly, they lost 2 pilots. So the other pilots in particular, but all the aviators were upset, and were upset at Al. And he went down there and had to explain himself. And he told them, I overloaded the plane. We had no other choice. This is war. I would do it again. I'm sorry. And I flew in one of those overloaded. You know, I risked my own life. We have to risk our life as part of our operation, but that's the only way we're going to save these people. There's really no other way. We just don't really have another choice. And somehow they accepted it. Somehow they appreciated his honesty. He also told them something he hadn't before, that he had bought life insurance, a $10,000 policy for each one of them, and he would personally go and give it to the widows. So, which ended up changing his mind, because after visiting one widow and giving her the check and being spit on and kicked by the widow and having that check thrown back at his face, he thought it might be better if someone else did that. But regardless, they accepted it and they moved on. So now they're in Panama, right? So you're an aviator in Panama. What do? Well, you have to kind of play the game. Well, first of all, they really have to plot out their way. They can't fly the northern route. The U.S. controls to a large degree the northern route. They'll intercept them and bring them right in. These are smuggled planes. Now, in the mind of the U.S. authorities, they don't care that it's Panamanian airline. All right, they know the truth. The Panamanians don't know the truth, but the Americans do. So they have to fly the southern route, and they have to really figure out where is safe. Where is safe to refuel? How can we make our way to Czechoslovakia in a way where we're undetected but efficient? You know, they have to, and how do we get the right licenses? They have to do all that. You know, they have to do all that. Harold Livingston goes to their license department and says, we need radio operation licenses for flight. They say, we don't do flight, we only do shipping. He says, well, now you're doing flight. And so they go and say, okay, the officials there, we'll look into that. He's scared. He thinks, okay, they're gonna figure out what we're doing, but they don't. They give him licenses, so they're putting it together. Meanwhile, they have to fool the Panamanians. Panamanians are demanding an airline. They want to be able to fly. So what they do is they fly livestock, cattle and sheep, etc., chickens. They fly them around the country. But you know, the Panamanians have had enough, and it's time to go also for the Operation Zebra, we'll call it. I can explain why that is later if anyone's interested, but Operation Zebra. Well, at this point, it's good to say that the destination is Zebra. In other words, the code name for the destination is Zebra. They use code names. It's Žatec, Czechoslovakia. That's where they're going to pick up the arms. That's where they're going to pick up the weapons and planes too. They bought some fighter planes, which I'll tell you about. And so they tell the Panamanians, look, we're going to do a big route survey flight tomorrow morning, all 9 planes, all 9 C-46s. The Kani was not with them. The Kani that managed to get out, the Kani was already actually in Czechoslovakia, already loading up at the time, and made it to Israel a couple of weeks before the war. The other 2 Kanis never made it out, unfortunately. They didn't have enough pilots who could fly the Kanis and couldn't escape in time, and they got grounded and held up. So there were 9 C-46s. They went on a route survey flight the next morning, circled around, and disappeared on their southern hemisphere route to get to Czechoslovakia. It's a fascinating journey that I can tell you about that would be fun. I'll just mention maybe a couple of instances. One of them, refueling stops, is in Casablanca, Morocco, where they land, and there's a protest against Israel there, the creation of Israel. And the protesters are saying, down with the Jews, kill the Jews. But they really want to go into Casablanca. They want to go into town, have fun. These guys like to have fun. They want to have a drink. They want to have some food, some local food, some couscous. So they asked the airport manager, do you have anyone here who could guard our plane? This was one plane at that particular moment. The co-pilot was Shelley Eichel, who went by Ike, who told me the story. And then I confirmed it with someone else who was there. Anyway, Ike said to the manager, they have someone that can guard our plane while we go into town. And he said, yes, these guys, the protesters, they actually work here. They're just on their break. So these anti-Jewish protesters are guarding the plane. And they go and have a meal, and it hit them. What are we doing? I mean, if they even, you know, just peek into the C-46s, we're in big trouble. And that particular C-46 was carrying weapons. So, you know, they had these kind of moments. Luckily, they didn't look, and they were able to fly away. They did get grounded in some places. They used the mafia to help them in some connections and set up a major refueling stop in Sicily. And they make it to, I'm watching the time because I want to make sure we get to the story. So yeah, I won't describe some of the other stops yet. We have to get on. So they get to Žatec in Czechoslovakia. And it's an interesting place. It's a small town that was obviously occupied, like the rest of Czechoslovakia, by the Nazis. The big plaza there was called Hitler Square, and the hotel they're staying in now, of course, it's complete change. Now it's become communist. It's called Stalingrad. So it's very much behind the Iron Curtain, but they feel more secure there, right? They feel like they can kind of be themselves now, finally, because the Czech are in on this. Not the population, but the government. They're selling Israel $11 million worth of arms. $11 million is, if it sounds like a lot of money, it is. It's very much an inflated price. They overcharged the Israelis, but the Israelis were happy to pay any price and did it. Al Schwimmer was upset about this, in particular when it came to planes, because he felt that not only were the Czech overcharging the Israelis, they were really giving them inferior product, and he could buy much better product for a lot less money. So what were the Czechs selling Israel? What did the Israelis buy? What were these guys about to smuggle into the emerging new state of Israel? What planes? Nazi surplus. These were all Nazi surplus. The Germans, during World War II, as they were being bombed by the Allies later in the war, relocated their arms manufacturing to Czechoslovakia, where they could hide it, in a sense. And it worked. It actually worked very well. And these factories actually stayed intact through the war. And so they had a lot of surplus Mauser rifles, machine guns, German machine guns, bullets, and Messerschmitt fighter planes, at least the Czech version. They had a lot left over from those days. Plus, they still had these factories, and they knew how to make these weapons. And they figured, you know, we're in the communist bloc. We're not benefiting from the Marshall Plan. We could use some foreign currency, especially dollars. So they continued to manufacture some of these things. For instance, they continued to manufacture the Messerschmitts, but it was a much inferior version of it at this point. It had the body of the Messerschmitt, the fighter plane, the workhorse fighter plane that the Germans used, particularly in the first half of the war, and often used it quite successfully. But it didn't have the engine or the propeller. The reason it didn't have the right engine is because that factory that built those engines in Czechoslovakia burned down from a fire, not from being bombed. This was after World War II. It was somehow ignited and went up in flames. So instead of using the Messerschmitt engine, they had to sub out and use a Junkers engine, a bomber, which was the worst of both worlds. On one hand, it was too heavy, actually, for the body of the Messerschmitt, but on the other, it was also underpowered. So too heavy, but less power. Really, not a good deal. And it was tough to take off and tough to land, and a lot of these Messerschmitts crashed. The propeller, there was an even bigger problem, because it was a different propeller than they used to have. I'm not sure exactly the reason why that is the case. I don't know. All I know is that it was the wrong propeller with the wrong number of blades that was out of sync with the two machine guns that were mounted on the Messerschmitts. So many times pilots shut themselves down and crashed when they were using the machine guns. So not ideal, and really infuriated Al. Al and his men at the time had struck a deal with Mexico to buy weapons, and Mexico wanted to sell them P-51s and P-47s, American-built fighter planes, excellent, some of the best in the world at the time, for, by the way, a fraction of what the Czech were charging, a fraction. Not to mention that, you know, the pilots that they had recruited, many of them Americans, Canadians, some South Africans, would be much more familiar with flying such a plane versus a Messerschmitt, and the training would be quicker for many of them, not all of them, but for many. So I was upset and tried to convince Yehuda Arazi, who then took it to the leader of the country, David Ben-Gurion, and David Ben-Gurion had to rule on this. It went all the way to the top, and he ruled in favor of the Messerschmitts. And the reason he did it was simple, because he believed in quick, immediate, guaranteed results. He was facing a genocide of his people. He couldn't take chances. The weapons that Israel, that indirectly through Al and his men, bought from Mexico were being held up. The Americans were putting pressure on Mexico, and even though Mexico sold the weapons, took the money, and the ship to pick them up, this was going to be sent by ship. They thought they had plenty of time because this was bought several months in advance, was docked there at the port waiting for these weapons. And every day they would say they're coming, but the weapons were not coming. Eventually they did, but at the time that Ben-Gurion had to make the decision, the weapons weren't coming, so he wasn't ready to make a deal with Mexico. Yes, better planes, yes, much cheaper, but we don't know if and when they'll arrive. These are, yes, inferior planes, very expensive, but who cares? We're going to get them. We know we're going to get them. So Al had to bring them. What did they do? They couldn't fly them in, even though they had recruited fighter pilots who learned how to fly them, and in theory could fly them in, or maybe even the Czech pilots could do it. There was no way to really get them to Israel directly, because they would have had to make 4 refueling stops, which of course is a lot anyway. but these are not, you can't make 4 refueling stops with a fighter plane on its way to Israel. You're going to get detected. I mean, you're lucky if you can find one place that would allow such a landing and a refueling. You're not going to find 4. Unrealistic, ain't happening. So they took apart the Messerschmitts, they took them apart, stuck half, like the engine and fuselage, in one C-46, crammed them in, and crammed the other part into another C-46, and then flew them in. The C-46s only needed 1 refueling stop, and I drew less, attention as a transport plane under the guise of the Panamanian national airline than a fighter plane, a German fighter plane being flown suddenly, in Europe, period, anywhere, much less to Israel, out of Czechoslovakia. So this is what they did. Of course, it meant that when you got them to Israel, you had to reassemble them. So meanwhile, the fighter pilots are being trained, and they're being trained in groups of 5. And the first group has among them 1 American, Lou Leonard, who's the commander. He was the most experienced. He was a Marine fighter pilot during World War II. He had flown in the Pacific. He was Hungarian. He grew up in Hungary and then moved with his family, all Jewish, to a farming town in Pennsylvania, and found out, of course, wanted to really, fight the Nazis, fight on the east, but ended up being sent to the west, to the Pacific. Ended up finding out that many of his family members, extended family members in Hungary, were killed by the Nazis. So he was frustrated, and this was his reason for joining. He wanted to fly, and he didn't care what plane. Yeah, Messerschmitt's Nazi plane. That's all right. I get to fight now. I get to fight for my people. And one of the first things he received, along with the other aviators, was a flight jacket, a beautiful little flight jacket. And when he looked at it, he realized it still had a swastika on it. He had to tear it off. So, he adjusted. He did what he had to do. The other pilots, there was another American among the 5, and there were 2 Israelis who had fought with the British. They served in the British Air Force, actually, during World War II, and 1 South African. So these were the 5, and they were training, and they still had a long way to go, but the war had started. So the airlift has begun. The C-46s have arrived. They're airlifting. The planes are filled with weapons and all parts of Messerschmitts, and they're going nonstop to Israel. And this is allowing the Israelis to survive. They are able to send more and more troops into battle. They're able to fight for longer. They have the bullets to do it now. Otherwise, they were going to run out in a day or 2. And they're not winning the war. In a sense, really, in those first 2 weeks, they're technically losing the war still, but not at the level that was expected. And part of it is that they have the weapons and they can fight these battles and hold back some of the Arabs. And part of it is that the Arabs were so confident that they would win the war, that there was some complacency in some places. For instance, the Egyptians had a great plan for one of their main divisions of 10,000 troops and about 50 or 60 tanks. Make a beeline to Tel Aviv. You get to Tel Aviv, the war is over, because Tel Aviv was, even though it wasn't Israel's official capital then and isn't now, was very much the heart of the country. This is where the government was. This is where the industries were, the business, the leaders in every category. Even the military really had its headquarters there. So you get to Tel Aviv, you destroy Tel Aviv, you take it over, it's over. You ripped out the country's heart. So it was a really good plan. They probably could have got there in a week, but they took their time. Part of why they took their time is, maybe they stopped for a battle here or a battle there. In a couple of spots, the Israelis attacked and tried to hold them also as well, so they get credit for that. But for the most part, they were somewhat complacent also. But the combination prolonged, at least, what seems still inevitable, that Israel would lose. And so Lou Leonard and the other pilots who are being trained in Czechoslovakia on these death traps of planes that they really can't stand and know they need a lot more training on, realize we got to go back. If we don't go back now, there won't be anything to fight for. So it doesn't matter if we're ready, we have to go. Also, what are we going to do? You know, at that point, they calculated that by the time they're ready to fight, which would be on May 29th, 1948, 2 weeks after the war started, they would only have 4 Messerschmitts in operation. The Egyptian Air Force had 50 Spitfires, brand new Spitfires. The Syrians had 50 assorted other planes. The Egyptians also had many other planes like Dakotas that they use as bombers. The Egyptians were coming into Tel Aviv every day with their Spitfires and Dakotas and attacking civilians and military installations. They had total control of the skies. What do you do with 4 Messerschmitts against that? So they came up with an interesting plan, which was to attack just before dawn, while it was still dark, to attack El Arish. El Arish, which is south of Gaza, on the Mediterranean, in the Sinai, technically, was the main base, not the only one, but the main base out of which the Spitfires came. So the plan was to use all 4 Messerschmitts to go drop bombs and destroy as many of the Spitfires as possible on the ground. They thought maybe they could even destroy a couple of dozen, which would obviously make a difference, would make it more attainable to try to go up and try to, if not claim the sky, at least keep the Arabs from completely controlling the skies, or at least keep them out of Tel Aviv, right? So that was the plan, and that's what they arrived to do. And as soon as those Messerschmitts were reassembled on May 29th, they were going to do this. That's it. They were going to do it, and they were doing the final inspection of the Messerschmitts, which were inside one of the hangars of the base. And as they come out to go, you know, for a few hours to maybe get some sleep, or probably more to have a drink, a jeep rolls up, stops at their feet, and a commando jumps up. Avidan was his name, and says, "I have a new plan for you. We got to do something else." What? He says, "Look, the Egyptian division, that 10,000 troop division with the 50, 60 tanks and heavy artillery and etc., is right a few miles from here. They're only a few miles from Tel Aviv. They're marching toward Tel Aviv. The only thing that stopped them tonight is the fact that we blew up the bridge. There's a bridge over a river that they blew up, but they're building a temporary bridge over it, so as we speak. Tomorrow, they're probably going to restart their march. By tomorrow night, they're probably in Tel Aviv, probably the next day. And if you're talking about the Israeli military, our ground troops and what we have, we don't have the means to stop them. We can't. We just don't. We can slow them down a bit, maybe cause a little damage, but we can't. So you have to attack them. And the Israeli commander of the Air Force didn't like that. And why didn't he like that? Why did he argue against it? First of all, he really liked the plan to go destroy, you know, a couple of dozen Spitfires in one fell swoop would be a game changer. But second, he thought, I'm the head of the Air Force. This is brand new. We just started. This is it. Now we finally have an Air Force. We have 4 Messerschmitts, 5 pilots. We're about to launch our first mission. If they go and attack these 10,000 troops with their heavy artillery, there's a good chance all 4 get shut down. Not to mention it will at some point really alert the Egyptian Air Force that will send in Spitfires, right? It's not like a sneak attack. You go, you blow them up, you come back. It's an ostentatious type of display when you attack a division like that and try to cause real damage. You can't just go in, do it, and come back. You have to fight. And that fight is going to bring a response, a massive response. And that response could lead to the full destruction of the Israeli Air Force. He could easily see how all 4 planes would be shut down and how all 4 pilots would be captured and or killed. So he says no. But Lou decides to do it anyway. He says, yeah, these are all true. And yeah, that plane was really good. But if we don't stop the Egyptians tonight, it's over. If they get to Tel Aviv, it really doesn't matter how many Spitfires we destroyed. They'll still have plenty left. It's over. The war is over. They can go kill all the leaders of the country, or worse, arrest them and torture them. I mean, God only knows, right? I mean, it's a terrible situation. So he tells his men, Okay, I'm starting to run out of time, but I need to complete this story at least. Of course, I don't think you want me to leave you hanging with this one. So he tells his men, we got to do it. And not only do we have to do it, we actually have to start all 4 Messerschmitts inside the hangar. Why? They only had 1 truck. So that meant that the truck would have to drive them to the runway 1 at a time. The Egyptians were already bombing this airbase. In fact, the previous day, they had destroyed the 2nd hangar. If they see a truck pushing and pulling 4 Messerschmitts, what do you think they're going to do? So we have to start them in a hangar. But that could also destroy the whole Israeli Air Force in one fell swoop. You know, one spark goes off, the whole place blows up. But they had to do it. And they started all 4 engines in the hangar, and they took off, and they attacked. And how well did that attack go? It depends how you look at it. By Lou's estimate, and by the others as well, I did not interview Ezer Weizmann, who was one of the pilots, but I did interview his wife. Ezer Weizmann ended up being the president of Israel, and I interviewed the first lady, wonderful woman, and she remembered. So I have their description, and I also interviewed the sons of another pilot. And Shelley Eichel was able to witness it because he had been injured from a crash, and he was on a hill, in a hospital on a hill, and he got a full view of the whole thing. So these were my primary sources, plus many other documents and historians that I've talked to and documents I've read, piecing it together. By their estimate, it was not successful because, you know, they had 3 passes, they came in. Lou said they might have killed 50 or 60 troops and maybe blew up 1 or 2 tanks. That's about it. That's really about it. They also lost 1 plane and 1 pilot, Eddie Cohen, who was, as I mentioned, the South African. They lost him. And so here goes a quarter of the Israeli Air Force, right? So they were a little upset about this when they came back. When I think about it objectively, I think that's still damage. I think you do 3 passes, 3 of the planes survive, you kill 50, 60 troops. It's a lot of people, actually, at a time when the Egyptians were complacent. You destroy, let's say, even only 2 tanks. It's still something. But nonetheless, I recognize that even really doesn't matter. What matters is what happened next. And that is that the Egyptians were shocked. And even though the pilots were depressed, losing Eddie Cohen was depressing, the fact that they didn't cause more damage was depressing, the fact that all their machine guns jammed and they couldn't go for another pass was depressing. Another Messerschmitt was damaged soon thereafter. They get intelligence reports from the Egyptians who were shocked that Israel had an Air Force. No one in the world, including the Israelis, by the way, except for a few select people like David Ben-Gurion, knew that there was such a capability that the Israelis had. And this shocked the Egyptians so much so that, coupled with an attack by the ground troops and another attack that they did via airplanes in the next few days, stopped the Egyptians. And the Egyptians never moved any closer to Tel Aviv or to winning this war or really any other war. Yeah, they had some gains in '73, but nothing like this. This was the chance to really destroy and the Jewish state, the baby state, right? To nip it in the bud. And it was stopped. And it was stopped thanks to aviators who had the vision, the foresight to understand that for Israel to survive, it's not enough for them to have weapons. They have to have an Air Force. Even if it uses inferior planes, it must have an Air Force. So there's a lot more I can tell you, but at least I got to tell you the gist, the main parts of the story. And there are many other things that happen after that, but I can just leave you before we go into the Q&A with this notion that after this, the war turned around. And really over the next few weeks, Israel stabilized. And after that, it was no longer a question of whether Israel survives. It quickly became a question of how much Israel secure, and that if Israel was going to survive, maybe it needed a little more land than it was given. And Israel ends up with a lot more land, winning a lot more land during this war that ends in January 1949, and ends up having one of the best air forces in the world to this day, an air force that has never lost a dogfight. So we'll take questions now. I do have a couple of surprises for you. We have with us 2 people who are connected to the operation. One is Al Rustin. Al Rustin was a pilot in the operation who flew B-17s. I did not get a chance to tell you that story. That happens a little later, happens in June. And we also have with us Marvin Klimo. Marvin Klimo was one of Al Schwimmer's best friends and worked with him very closely for years after the operation, during which Al Schwimmer created and ran Israel Aircraft Industries, today known as Israel Aerospace Industries. So I'll be joined by Marvin and Al Rustin. Please join me. And we are open to questions. So let me know what you'd like me to discuss, or any of us to discuss.
Well, before we get going on, I've just unmuted Marvin. Marvin, do you want to go ahead and confirm that that we can hear you?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We have you loud and clear. I'm not sure that we have Al on the line, however.
Oh, okay. Al, are you with us?
Okay, it doesn't look like we have Al, but we do, however, have a big stack of questions here. So okay. I'm ready when you guys are.
We're ready. I know Marvin's ready.
So I think the biggest question that seems to be echoed in our question window here is, this is a story that's not necessarily well known in the United States, but is it well known in Israel? Is the average Israeli aware of the role that was played by these foreign parties in the establishment of their Air Force?
No, the average Israeli has never heard of this, has no idea, and has a complete misunderstanding of really what took place, not just in terms of this operation, but the whole geopolitical setup. So most Israelis are unaware that the US really opposed the creation of a Jewish state. They believe, as I did growing up in Israel, that the US helped create the Jewish state. Many Israelis don't understand that Israel and the United States were not always best friends. In fact, it took 20 years before Israel really became even a minor ally of the United States. So 20 years, America was either distant or in some cases antagonistic, as it was in 48 and again in 56 to Israel. So no, they're not aware. They're not aware of this story. It clashes with what we know of, or at least what we think we know, right, of American-U.S. relations. It clashes with that. Also, it was a secret operation, so they kept it secret, the ones who did know, and the Americans who took part were probably the most humble group of people I ever met in my life, probably much like the rest of the greatest generation. They did great things and they were humble at the same time, and they didn't go around bragging about it. So no, the Israelis don't know about it, Americans don't know about it. In fact, I would say probably now more Americans know about it than Israelis, because A Wing and a Prayer was seen by millions of people on PBS and millions of people since then via streaming sites. And now the book I don't think is being read by millions, of course, but it adds up. So we don't have anywhere near those numbers in Israel yet. Hopefully we can change that, right, Marvin? Marvin, do you want to add to that? Why the story is not known in Israel? Or would you like to comment on that?
Al hired me in 1969, and when I started traveling to Israel, a lot of people in the military and the government knew the story. Ben-Gurion called Al the best machal, and machal means volunteer. And Ben-Gurion was in love with Schwimmer.
Oh, yeah.
And I'd like to do a transition. After the war was over, Al went back to Burbank and opened Schwimmer Aviation again. And in 1953, Ben-Gurion, along with his junior military guy, who was a civilian, named Shimon Peres, made a visit without notifying Al to Burbank. He said, "What are you doing this in America? Open up a plant in Israel." And Al moved to Israel in 1954 and opened a company called Bedek Aviation with 70 employees and $1 million from the government. And to show you the kind of man that Al was, his badge number was like 43. You'd think as the president he'd have badge 1, but Al had no ego, and I'll come back to that later. So you're right. Today's generation doesn't know what happened. As an example, I don't know, 1985, 86, I was in Israel. Al was no longer with IAI, but I wanted to go say hello to him like I did on every visit. And I called Marina, his wife, and he says, "Al's over in the marina on his boat." When I get to the marina, I don't know what Al's boat looks like. I asked 3 people, "Where's Schwimmer's boat? Who's Schwimmer? Who's Schwimmer?" So I had to use my brain. I looked for a white-haired man or a bald man And I said, where's Schwimmer? They thought, Schwimmer. And they pointed out the boat. The younger generation, which is disturbing to me, have been going to Israel for 50 years. There's a place on Hayakon Street, and only older Israelis will know this, was the Red House. It's where the Sheraton Hotel is now. That's where Ben Gurion ran the war from. There's a plaque there. The house was taken down. The average Israeli under 30, 40 has no idea what I'm talking about. That's a shame.
Yeah, that's a great story, Marvin. I mean, to think that Al Schwimmer, I mean, who should have been famous just for having created Israel's largest, most innovative employer that still employs 60,000 people to this day, and that he was one of the key people in turning Israel into the startup nation that it is, the technology hub that it is. And in the 80s, that people didn't know him, much less what he did in 48. So yeah, it's sad, and hopefully we can change that.
I tried, for years, I tried to get Al nominated to the American Aviation Hall of Fame, actually international, like Sandy McDonald, like Donald Douglas, like Leon Grumman, like, who am I leaving out? Bill Boeing, the Curtis. And Al says, who needs that? He had no ego. It was absolutely amazing. He said, does that help Israel? No, I don't need that. He deserves to be in the Aviation Hall of Fame.
Right. Great. Yeah, we're ready for more questions.
All right, we've got another one here. It probably comes as a surprise to most of our listeners that America was not willing to come to Israel's aid for all the reasons that you described. In fact, its sort of passionate neutrality on this issue had the effect of assisting the Arab nations to some degree. Can you expand a little bit on why this was the case? Was it a question of getting oil and securing relationships in the Arab world, or was it done to kind of support the British position on the Arab world as a way of keeping the British on our side during the Cold War? Or what on the geopolitical side of things, what was America's reticence to support a group of people that, by and large, the average American probably thought were worthy of supporting?
Yeah, a great question and very well asked. So I would say all of the above, plus a few more reasons that I'll give. So yes, the oil, absolutely. America needed the oil. America was leading the global expansion, right? The economic recovery after World War II. Oil was essential. It was coming from the Middle East. America, up until that point, actually had its own oil and was a large producer, but now needed additional oil, needed the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was imported. The British were really, really important. The British were really entrenched with the Arabs. They were not just supplying the Arabs, they were entrenched with them. They had made Egypt and Jordan and Iraq their official protectors. When the Jordanians fought in 1948, they were led into battle by British soldiers. The British flew reconnaissance planes over Israel and gave information to the Arabs during the war. The British fighter pilots went up on the very last day of the war, in January 1948. British fighter pilots went up against the Israeli Air Force, mostly American fighter pilots. And it almost led to a renewed war directly this time with Britain. Britain was very upset. Why? Because the score between the British and the Israeli Air Force was 5-0. Five British planes went down in one day to inferior planes, mostly, again, Americans, who did not want to be shooting down the British with whom they had fought in World War II. So they sent him an apology note after that saying, oh, just come have a beer with us, don't fight us. We're friends. Anyway, Britain was really entrenched with the Arabs, and Britain was key to America because Britain was the key ally during World War II, and I was the key ally in the Cold War. America really needed a strong ally during the Cold War, and that was Britain all the way. And Britain has remained America's top ally to this day, right? If you have to think, who's America's #1 ally for 80 years, it's Britain, probably more. So that was probably enough of a reason, right? To just side to some degree. I would say it was more than neutrality because the steps that were taken were often antagonistic against Israel. I'll tell you about one in particular in a second. But there were other reasons besides these. And they were, first of all, America likes to go with winners. Israel was going to lose. There's no way that this little entity with no infrastructure, no air force, very few weapons, even if we gave them some weapons, they're going to lose. America doesn't support losers. America supports winners, right? So that's one. Second, another reason, sheer numbers, right? The Arabs have millions and millions of people. I think at the time about 50 or 60 million people Israel had 600,000, and many of them refugees, and bringing in more refugees. This was not a market for American companies or American expansion either, right? Very little you could do with that. It's a meaningless entity. It doesn't move the needle, as they would say on Wall Street. And here's the other interesting reason. One of the big reasons, and why really Secretary Marshall really had Truman's ear to some degree on some of this, was that the argument that he made really resonated. And here it was, in addition to everything else. We must keep Russia out. So the Soviet Union wanted a foothold in the Middle East. They wanted a foothold. They wanted to gain some access. But all the players were taken. You know, Saudi Arabia was firmly on America's side. And the other countries, as I mentioned, were either with the French or the British. There was no real entity available for the Russians to become allies with and gain a foothold, which is why the Soviet Union was pivotal in the creation of a Jewish state. This is another thing that Israelis and Americans don't know. The proposal for the partition in the UN came from the Soviet Union. They brought it up initially, they brought it up officially. Soviet Union. It's no coincidence that Czechoslovakia, a communist country in the Soviet bloc, sold Israel weapons. The Soviets clearly authorized it, allowed it to happen, no question about it. The Soviets really thought that they could team up with the Israelis, not because they liked Jews. Stalin was a notorious anti-Semite, but because they saw an amazing opportunity. In many ways, to them, the Jews made a lot of sense. Who were these Jews? Eastern European Jews. What were they? Socialistic. David Ben-Gurion was a socialist his whole life. He created the Statut. The Statut is a trade union, a workers' union, but not like what you think of a trade union here. It's a trade union that represents the workers and the management. It owns the companies. It owns the National Health Service, and so forth and so on. The leading construction company in Israel to this day, Solel Boneh, was part of the Statut. They may have sold it off by then. So this is, economically speaking, as socialist as you get. Some might even argue verges on communism, not politically. Very clearly it was going to be a democracy. That was never in question, but economically. So here were Eastern European Jews, many of them Russians. David Ben-Gurion admired the Soviet Union. He cried when he went there in 1923 to visit. He met with Trotsky. He went to the May Day celebrations. He was in awe. He came back in awe of the Soviet Union. So David Ben-Gurion loves the Soviet Union, a clear ally. And in fact, we believe, and this is not for my, what I'm about to tell you is not for my primary research. Everything else I've told you is from primary research, talking to people who were there, experts, etc., looking at FBI documents, you name it. What I'm about to say is more me reading stuff and putting it together and speculating. So I'm entering a different territory. But from what I've read and from what I speculate, Soviet Union even made an official, secret but official, overture to David Ben-Gurion to become allies, and he was smart enough to say no. Which you know, if we have time and people are interested, I can again speculate on why he said no. But we know that you know, the deal with the Czech ended abruptly. The Israelis were kicked out, and soon after that, the Soviet Union went from helping to create Israel, from helping to block America in the UN, from stopping the creation of the Jewish state, which is the thing I mentioned earlier. I would bring up. So after the partition plan was passed in November 29, 1947, again led by the Soviet Union, proposed by the Soviet Union, but voted on, among others, the 33 yes votes. One of them came from the US. The US voted yes. Truman had a soft heart for the Jews. His best friend was Jewish, and they voted yes. State Department and the UN delegation for the United States quickly changed its mind, felt this was a mistake, and came up with a new proposal to nullify the partition plan and prevent the creation of a Jewish state. They call it a trusteeship, where instead of the British, who were going to leave regardless, instead of the British controlling Palestine, the UN was going to control Palestine. Pretty simple, right? Simple idea, but really more of the occupation. And the Soviet Union stopped them from doing that. But after Ben-Gurion, I believe, said no, Soviet Union turned on Israel and started to look for another ally.
Boaz, with your permission, I'd like to tell another Schwemmer story. And believe it or not, the punchline is going to be Oceana Naval Air Station.
Please do.
Where where the museum is located.
Please do.
Al built IAI up to 4,000 employees from 1954 to 1966. And then the 67 war happened. And the French embargoed Israel after Israel had bought Mirage airplanes, which de Gaulle would not deliver. Many years later, well, a few years later, a Swiss engineer where Switzerland was building the Mirage under license, was upset that the Israelis didn't get the Kafir, or the Mirage, I should say. And Which Schwemmer devised the plan to get all the plans for building the Mirage to Israel. Too long to explain it, but it was Schwemmer who got it. The plans came to Israel, and they started building a replica of the Mirage, except they didn't like the Seneca engine, and they put in a GE engine. And that was, suddenly Israel was building fighter airplanes called the Kafir. In the mid-'80s, under the Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, they had a shortfall of training pilots to duplicate what they had Top Gun on the West Coast. They wanted to have a Top Gun type on the East Coast. I think it was VF-43, if I'm not mistaken. My memory holds. And lo and behold, the airplanes that started in France, went to Israel, were delivered to Oceana Naval Air Stations, a squadron, and operated. And I'm sure if there are any people listening on this cast, they'll remember the Kafirs operated. So it's a hell of a long story from Paris to Israel to Oceana.
That's great. Thank you, Marvin. I think we're ready for another question.
I will say that you definitely have one listener who knows intricate details about the Kafirs here at Oceana, because the museum's founder, Jerry Yagan, his company actually maintained them while they were here. So those Kafirs are near and dear to the heart of the museum here. But I think our next question has to be about whether or not the folks that Al Schwimmer brought over to Israel and to Czechoslovakia were considered uniformed combatants. Did they officially join an Israeli armed service, or were they technically airline pilots at the point at which they were flying these combat missions? And a kind of follow-up question to that was, what uniforms were they wearing? Were there flying clothes, previously Luftwaffe issue clothing, or what was available to them?
So there's some distinction, great question. There's some distinction between the fighter pilots and the transport pilots, although the transport pilots went into combat after they would smuggle in the planes to Israel. On their way back to Czechoslovakia, they would drop bombs. So they engaged in bombing, even in Cairo and in Damascus in Syria. So they were involved in a lot of different aspects. But so we'll start with the transport pilot. The transport pilots remain in civilian clothes throughout. You know, they had to pretend, obviously, to be the Panama airline. Eventually, that was stripped from them, and even if they were flying for some other commercial entity that they made up, they still had to pretend that they were civilians. So they wore civilian clothes, and for a while they were left alone and able to continue this way. But then politics got in the way, and they wanted them to become part, as you mentioned, part of the Air Force, start to wear uniforms and become part of the Air Force and take orders, etc. And Al had to take it all the way to Dvir Gurion and get Dvir Gurion to stop that, because the pilots did not like it. They did not want to become soldiers. You know, it's going to put them at greater risk. Going back to the U.S., they already faced a lot of risk, and it just wasn't. Even though they were really, you know, flying combat, like I said, all of them, and many of them unfortunately paid with their lives, they were not ready to do that. They were mostly Americans, and like that notion of being volunteers. So they managed to stay that way through the end of the war. And many of them stayed to the end and continued to do many things that I can describe if we had time, but we don't. So maybe read the book or watch. You have to read the book, because in documentary, I didn't have time to get into all that either. Very interesting stuff that they did. The fighter pilots were a little different, you know, in a sense that there were fighter pilots and there were Israelis among them. And so they were also left alone for a while, but eventually did have to become part of the military, wear uniforms, and go by the hierarchy, which in the Israeli military is more casual, but nonetheless, they did have to adhere to that. I'm not aware of any fighter pilot that had a problem with that or left or refused to do that, actually. I'm not. So, yeah, and you know, the one thing though is that they continued. The official language for the Air Force through the whole war, through the end of the war, was English. So even though the commanders were Israeli, the top commanders, all the manuals were in English, all the meetings were in English, all the conversations, the radio control orders and messages that they got, everything was in English. This was an English-speaking Air Force.
Sounds like you're ready for another one. Boaz, you began this journey, you describe it in the documentary as a discussion with your grandfather, where he noticed the weapon he was using to defend his nascent country had a German eagle on it, and the sort of charge was to find out where that had come from. You explored the relationship of the arrival of the airplanes, and they no doubt brought weapons with them, but was it exclusively through Czechoslovakia that the ground forces were equipped also?
So it wasn't exclusively, and I can talk about some other sources, but it was mostly Czechoslovakia. So the Israeli military had two needs that Czechoslovakia met. Two needs in terms, I'm talking now in terms of the weapons, talked about the Air Force. One was sheer volume of weaponry, right? They needed a lot of weapons from one source that they can make a deal with. And even though they were able to manufacture some bullets and get some other weapons from Mexico, as I mentioned, although those weapons arrived way late, I think they didn't use them till July, so a couple of months into the war, they still needed the sheer volume, and that did come from Czechoslovakia. This was a massive, massive airlift, a non-stop airlift of 100 million rounds of ammunition, and I mean, just enormous, right? But there's another aspect to it that's really key. You see, when you run a military and you run a war, you need your weaponry on some level to also be uniform, no pun intended, right? You can't have a wild assortment of 50 different types of rifles and 100 different types of rounds of ammunition from all sorts of different sources, right? Because you can't run it. You can't run it like that. You need some sort of uniformity, and this provided it. Now, the third aspect of it is quality. There's some quality control. Even though the Messerschmitts were bad, right? Bad, really bad. I can talk more about that if anyone wants to hear more. The weapons were very good. The Mausers were excellent. The bullets were reliable. The machine guns were top-notch. These were excellent weapons. So they really met those three needs: volume, sheer enormous volume, consistency across the board, and quality through the airlift. It saved them. They were still able to get some weapons, as I said, later on from Mexico, here and there, manufactured. Some from France, so, they were always able to finagle and get, and they always tried and did what they could, Some of these operation members got a donation of Thompson machine guns from the Italian mafia. As I mentioned, some of them stole some machine guns from the US Navy. But yes, mostly the Israelis fought with Nazi surplus weapons airlifted by Americans from communist Czechoslovakia.
This next one is perhaps a question Marvin will be able to weigh in on as well.
Great.
When many of these men returned to their home countries, they were looked on quite harshly, accused as communists for having stayed in the Hotel Stalingrad, or traitors, and particularly as criminals. Some were convicted of felonies. Did Israel endeavor to look after them as veterans, and what was the sort of general experience of those who returned specifically to the U.S.?
So maybe I can answer this. Oh, go ahead, Marvin. Jump in. Yes.
Some were actually convicted. They were fined. They lost the rights of citizenship, not citizenship. Right? Losing the rights of citizenship, meaning you can't vote, you can't run for office, and there was one other thing I can't remember. Al, many years later, received a pardon from Clinton. And there was one other guy at the top named Hank Greenspun, who you might know, who was the PR guy for Bugsy Siegel in the Flamingo Hotel, who became the owner of the Las Vegas Sun. Hank made a donation of $25,000 to Nixon, and he got his pardon. Al told me, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not asking for a pardon. And finally, he got it through a friend of Clinton. In fact, there was a movie actor, I can't remember his name, who went to school with Clinton. Tommy Lee Jones just came to my mind. Okay.
Yeah, 12 operation members were put on trial, 11 were convicted. Sam Lewis, for some reason, the chief pilot, was exonerated. He connected, put it that way, had chemistry with a female juror who insisted that he was innocent for some strange reason, and so they didn't convict him.
That's a true
The other
story.
11 were convicted. Only one went to jail, Charlie Winters, a non-Jew, an Irish Catholic who sold Al Schwimmer 3 B-17s, one of which, Al Rothstein, flew out of Miami. What made Charlie, such a suspect was not just that he sold these, but that he helped them get out. He was an exporter and importer through Miami and the Caribbean, flying back and forth, and had a license to fly in and out, and provided that license, even though he knew what it was for, to Al, and even served as a co-pilot on one of the B-17s. And that was a bit much, and so they put him in prison for 18 months. Now, Al and his men who were convicted in Burbank were staring at 6 to 7 years of prison time. No doubt. They were guilty. What they were being charged with, they were guilty. By the way, they were very lucky. The biggest charge that could have come against them was never made. The FBI never figured out that they stole hundreds of machine guns in Hawaii from the US Navy. That was never discussed. That really would have been a problem. You're looking at another probably 10 or 15 years for that. So they were guilty. They knew they were guilty. They broke these laws. They were proud to break them and felt that they had no choice but to break them. And then something happened that saved them, a very strange incident, which if we have time, do we have time, Keegan? Should I tell you that, how they were saved?
I think let's go ahead and expound upon how they were saved, because I think those folks who are with us here are in it for the long haul and are very curious to find out more about it.
So there was a man named Lee Silverman who was a volunteer. You see, there were lots of volunteers who were not part of the operations, who went to Israel and served. For instance, Ralph Lowenstein, I'm not sure if he's with us now, was the second youngest volunteer to Israel. He served as a soldier, went on to become the dean of the College of Journalism at the University of Florida, became the consultant, historical consultant for When I Pray, in the documentary I made for PBS about this. So there were lots of volunteers. Lee Silverman was a volunteer who went. He was on scholarship to play basketball, a little Jewish guy, as a point guard for UCLA. And yet he gave that up and went and volunteered in Israel. And they ended up putting him at the Air Force. So he wasn't part of the operation, but because he spoke English, and this was an English-speaking Air Force, they put him there, and he became an intelligence officer for the Air Force. And that's how he got to know these guys. So then after the war, he's back at UCLA, finishing his studies, and goes to the trial in Los Angeles, where it took place, to see his buddies on trial and help them out. And as he comes in, they're impeling the jury. They're choosing the juror. And the attorneys for these guys, who were very good, were about to dismiss this one strange guy that they didn't know what to do with. And he walks in and tells them, no, you got to have this guy on. So he calls him over and he tells him why. As luck would have it, this guy, and forgive me, I forget his name, although I have his name in the book, and I have his picture even if not in the book, I have his picture also in the documentary. This guy was in one of Lee's UCLA's classes, a speech class. And during that class, the teacher asked them to give a speech about Israel, a speech and a counter speech. And one student gave an anti-Israel speech. So this guy stood up and gave the pro-Israel speech, and he was very passionate. And so Lee, the volunteer UCLA student who's just visiting, tells these guys, attorneys, put him on the jury. He's very pro-Israel. And indeed, when it came time to decide, here's what he told the other jurors, and here was what he told the judge. These guys are guilty, no question. I'm ready to vote guilty, but one condition, no prison time. And the judge said, you can't do that. You don't decide that. I decide if and how much prison time they serve. I said, I don't care. I'm going to hang the jury unless you promise me no prison time. And this went on for days. And as you might imagine, he wore everybody down. And finally, the judge allowed it. They were convicted felons. They had $10,000 fines, but none of them in that trial served any prison time.
You guys ready for another one?
Yes.
Okay. In light of the fact that we were intending to have Al Rothstein here with us, let's maybe talk a little bit about those B-17s that were brought over. Was the intended purpose to actually build up a strategic bombing wing? And how were 3 B-17s, weary from World War II, able to hold their own against Arab air forces flush with war surplus kit from the Western Allies?
Yeah, great question. So Marvin, if you want to jump in on this, you can. I can answer, and you can maybe jump in after me if you like. Okay. So yeah, Al understood that having fighter pilots and fighter planes was not enough. Israel needed bombers, and C-46s were not going to do the job. So he goes back to the U.S. and buys bombers. He buys 4 B-17s. And B-17s are amazing. I agree with you. You know, they were a bit worn down, but they're still amazing planes and really could change the war, and did change the war for Israel. Really took it to a whole new level. So he buys 4 of these. He buys 3 from Charlie Winters and 1 actually from the U.S. Air Force, that somehow sells it to him. The one that he buys from the U.S. Air Force quickly becomes grounded because the U.S. Air Force realizes who it's sold to and took the money, but is not ready to release it to one of the FBI's most wanted men. So, you know, Al takes Leo Gardner, one of the pilots who had joined the operation initially, who was initially a fighter pilot, and they find someone on base that they knew in World War II. They seem to have connections everywhere. And this guy, who's Jewish, agrees to keep an eye on this plane and fuel it for them and let them know exactly where it is. And they fly in wearing their uniforms from World War II into Tulsa, Oklahoma, and get in. And as luck would have it, it's a rainy day and there's some sort of a party going on for the ROTC or something. And the gate guard asks them, "Are you here for the party?" And they say, "Yes, yes, of course we are." So he waves them in their taxi, and they tell the taxi, "Ah, just drop us off here." And then they go and they find the plane, and it's marked off as seized and not to be operated, but they know it's fuel. Their friend assures them of it, and they get in with flashlights. Neither one had ever flown a B-17. And of course, you know, Al is not even a pilot, although he could co-pilot. He's a flight engineer. But they managed to take this plane. They managed to take it and go down the tarmac and the runway and ignore the calls from the control tower to identify themselves and or stop and take off and still, I guess, take the plane. I don't know if it's stealing it because they paid for it. And then they have the 3 others that they fly. And again, Al Rothstein, who was supposed to be with us from Chicago, who was a great guy and one of the few survivors of the operation, who's 98 years old, was one of the pilots. They fly the B-17s from Miami to Puerto Rico, to the Azores, and from there to Žatec, to Zebra in Czechoslovakia, where they remilitarized them properly, according to a plan that they had, where they actually got, in some cases, even superior weaponry than was there before. And then they fly from Žatec, from Czechoslovakia, to Israel. But on the way, and one of the things I learned in my research, some of the things you learn initially and then you discover more. Initially, I thought that they did this on their own, but then it turned out that this was actually an official Israeli operation that they carried out. On the way, they bombed Cairo. So instead of going directly to Israel, they flew by Cairo and bombed, in this particular case, a couple of spots, including the King's Palace, at least one of his palaces, King Farouk's Cairo Palace. They don't really hit it, but they cause quite a stir. And in fact, this ends the attack on Tel Aviv, the air attack, the attempts. At this point, the fighter pilots are able to hold back a lot of the Egyptians, but they're still coming, right? And after this, the Egyptians understand, you know what? If we bomb their city, they're going to bomb ours, so it stops. So it's very effective. So those are the B-17s, and yes, even though they're war-weary, they're remilitarized in a way and flown by such expert pilots. In this case, many American pilots who had actually flown B-17s during the war, right? They didn't even have to train anyone. They actually had B-17 pilots already at this point in this operation, are flying them and giving support to ground troops and attacking key installations. And as I said, helping Israel not just survive, not just win the war, but really win big and gain a lot more ground than anyone expected. Yeah. So next question, please. If there's another one, I'd love to.
Sure.
Yeah.
We've just got a couple more here, and then we'll draw to a close.
Cool.
Our Spitfire here at the museum was actually recovered from Israel. It was part of a batch that Israel received from Italy in 1951. I think one of the questions that we all have here is, that's not altogether that long after this particular conflict. What changed to allow Israel's importation of more modern types? Ours became a trainer at Ramat David Airfield. And I think we're all just kind of curious, did Italy become part of a smuggling operation, or was this kind of an above board internationally sanctioned exchange of arms?
So Israel was actually able to get advanced weaponry soon into the war. They were able to buy something like 60 or so Spitfires from Czechoslovakia, actually. Czechoslovakia, that was the last sale that they made, was of Spitfires. And Al goes back to the US yet again and ends up buying two P-51s that he ships to Israel in crates, having taken them apart. And they're used in the war. So they were able to get, along with the B-17, some really advanced, really strong weaponry. Never though in the war quite to the level that the Arabs and the British had, but certainly enough to really win. After the war, what changed for Israel is that it won. That's what changed. Here was a country that was a loser, that was going to be destroyed, that was a nobody, and now suddenly it beat 5 invading armies, pushed back the British Air Force, established itself as a strong military, a strong Air Force, proved itself, and became an instant player on the global stage. Plus, Israel had plenty of money to buy weapons, and a lot of these countries were desperate. And a lot of the alignment geopolitically was shifting. One of Israel's early allies was France, for instance. France became very, very close to Israel soon after this, very close. And by 1956, Israel is fighting a war alongside France and Britain against Egypt. The Sinai. And Israel then has to leave the Sinai after having conquered it, mainly because you have the Fadaim, you have the terrorists coming into Israel and killing civilians to the tune of about 250 a year, which was a lot for such a small nation. Would be a lot anywhere, actually, even today, right? 250 people dying a year in terrorism. So Israel takes over the Sinai, and America threatens Israel that basically that America would push it out militarily, and Israel has to get out of there in 2 days. But all of these shift. Another ally, actually, of Israel, besides Italy selling weapons and France becoming a close ally and Britain changing even its tune to some degree, Germany becomes an ally for Israel as well, and remains so actually to this day. And probably one of, if you look at the decades and you have to think who was Israel's most consistent ally, it's Germany. Yeah, it's not as close as the US, but it goes back further than the US. And it wasn't as close then as France was, but France quickly left the scene, as Marvin described. So Germany, interestingly enough, most consistent of Israel's allies through its inception and now.
As we get closer to the end, I'd like to come back to Al Schwimmer on 2 things. In the early 1970s, Al decided to buy some TWA passenger airplanes and was severely criticized for wasting money on them, until he converted 3 of them into aerial refuelers, which Israel needed for their fighter airplanes for deep missions. And the others were used as passenger and hospital airplanes in the 73 war to bring people back from the Suez Canal. So at first he was criticized, and then he was a hero for doing the right thing. But that's Al Schwimmer.
Right.
I'd like to just close my remarks with saying Al set the stage for what Israel Aerospace Industries is today. He was president from 54 to 79. Everything that Israel has today, space, fighter airplanes, passenger airplanes, there are 1,000 Israeli business jets operating in the United States through Gulfstream. The man was a visionary. And my definition of visionary is a man who's a dreamer but made his dreams come true. The last time I worked with Al, he calls me and he comes to the office in Washington and says, President Nixon has this SDI program. Israel has to be part of it. I said, Al, you're not in the company anymore. He pulls out a business card, special advisor to the prime minister. And we went in and had the very first discussion. Let me take out the we. Al had the first discussions on what turned out to be the Arrow missile. He convinced the United States that they had to allow Israel to be part of SDI. He convinced people in Congress that they had to fund it, and then we had to go through the technical side. But by that time, the Israeli government got involved. But setting the stage for doing Arrow was Al Schwemmer, even in the mid-'80s. The man was a genius. And I admit I'm a fan, and he's one of the greatest men I've ever met. And I was so proud to work with him.
Yeah, and he did all that, convincing American officials, doing all of that while he was still a convicted felon here in the United States.
That's right.
He's an amazing guy. The week I spent with him was one of the highlights of my professional life, without a doubt. I think about it often.
Can I close with one more story on Al? In 1970, when we started going around to all the consulates to meet the people in order to let them know we were building business jets and any recommendations, and we'd go to this consulate in Chicago, Philadelphia, Miami. Al didn't know any of the people. They all had Hebrew names. And Ben Gurion made anybody who moved overseas to represent the government to change their Russian, Polish, English names to Hebrew. So at the end of this visit, Al came up with a theory. When he gets back to Israel, he's going to write a book, Who Was Who?
That's great. Thank you, Marvin. Keegan, is there, I think you said there might be a final question.
Yeah, I think that final question, Boaz, has to be the film A Wing and a Prayer is available on Amazon and Hulu, and that's a great starting point for more information on this incredible, historical narrative. Where can we purchase your book? Can you perhaps provide an address here, and Victoria will put it in the follow-up email that goes out tomorrow. But
I can put it here. It's actually available in every major bookseller, from Amazon to Barnes & Noble, but I'll put the link on right now. So anywhere that you can buy, you can walk into a Barnes & Noble or go on their website, any of these, and find it. You can also, there's obviously also a digital version you can purchase if you don't want to get the actual hardcover. And there's an audiobook version also available on all the major sites. It's coming to Audible any day now, but it's in all the other major sites like audiobooks.com. Let me see, where do I put? Oh, here. So here's the Amazon link for Saving Israel, for the book, where it's available for Kindle and hardcover. The movie is also is no longer available on Hulu, because now it's available on Roku. Roku is becoming a big thing. So it's available, yes, still on Amazon Prime, free there, but it's also free now on Roku, ROKU, and Plex. These are the upcoming distributors, platforms that my distributor, Green Apple, felt like was the way to go after it was on Hulu for a while. So you can find it there and watch it for free there. And, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook. I'd love to hear from any of you who attended. Thank you so much. And, if you have any questions or want to follow up with me, you can email me. I'll give you, I'll even put my email address here. Here's my email address. I'm at Penn State. Here it is. Feel free to email me. Love to hear from you. And yeah, and then if you do read the book or watch the film, I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can always leave them there on Amazon or wherever, or you can email me them. Either way, I'd really love to hear what you think, because I am keen on getting the story out, particularly because I think it's inspirational. When I screen the film or when I give a book talk on campus, in various campuses around the country, I often look at the students and say, when they did all this, when they risked their lives and citizenship and used these innovative kind of maneuvering to save 600,000 people, they were in their 20s. And I say to the students, you're in your 20s. What are you going to do? What can you do? Because you can make a difference too. Believe me, you can make a big difference. What is it? So I think it's also the innovation that they used and the fact that they saw new problems in new light. You see, they could have just leaned on what they did though in World War II. They could have just gone back to that. They were very successful, but they understood that this is a new set of problems and required a new set of approaches, innovative approaches. I think that made all the difference. The Panamanian Airlines being one example, taking apart the Messerschmitts being another. They always looked at new problems with new eyes as opposed to just trying to go back to the well. And so they were able to really navigate this new terrain much better than they would have if they were marred down by, old practices. And I think that's the case for us today. We're facing new problems. And yes, I make historical films. I write historical nonfiction. I love history, and I think there's a lot to learn from it. But ironically, one of the things we can learn from history is that sometimes history doesn't repeat itself, and that there's a new set of challenges that we need new sets of answers for. Yeah, we had the Spanish flu 100 years ago, but we can't really tap into that completely. There's a new set of issues, and I think these guys who carried out this Operation Zebra, at least inspire us to see things in new ways.
Boaz, I think that's incredibly well put. So thank you very much for your time this evening. Thank you for the contributions that you've made to ensuring that this history isn't lost. I think we've all definitely enjoyed this presentation. We've appreciated the opportunity to speak with you. We'll look forward to a time when it is safe for you to travel here to the museum. We'll hopefully have a screening of the film and do this in a more traditional way. But thank you to everyone for joining us this evening and for your continued contributions to support our webinar program. Boaz, Marvin, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Keegan. Thank you, Marvin. And thank you, Victoria. And thank you for everyone who attended. Love to hear from you. Take care.
Bye-bye.